All right. So this morning we're looking at the book of Joshua again, and we've covered a lot of stuff. And in fact, when I spoke on Wednesday night, I knew where my sermon was going. And then by the time that I got to Friday, that's not where my sermon was going. So for those of you who came Wednesday night and you heard me say, this is where I'm going on Sunday, I'm sorry, it's probably better this way. We're looking at Joshua, and the book of Joshua is really one of the more difficult books of the Old Testament. It's difficult because there's a lot of stuff in here about God telling his people to do things that we don't want to think about God telling people to do. There's a lot of death, there's a lot of conquest, and it's hard for us to wrestle with that. And honestly, it's more difficult for us as a society to wrestle with this than it has been for societies of the past, or than it is even for other societies today. In Israel, there's very much this mindset of conquest even today, and we may mention that a little bit later. The concept of conquest is hard for us to grasp, and we're dealing with that a little bit more on Wednesday nights than we are here, but welcome you to come on Wednesday nights if you'd like to dig into that a little bit more. This week, we read some difficult stuff. We read about the defeat and eventual victory over Ai. And this is actually where I thought my message was going to go this week, and it didn't go here. And then we read about this part of the story where one of the groups of cities decided that they knew they couldn't beat the Israelites, so they didn't want to join them, so they decided to say, can we deceive them? And they deceived them. And there's a part of what we read this week that's just very hard for us to wrestle with, as Israel made a treaty with people who were actually next in line to be conquered, and then found out, oh, that messes things up. This is not what God told us to do. And then there's a battle against 5 kings, and a little bit of what we read this morning that was a little bit more gruesome. By the way, we never said that the Bible was rated G. Just in case you're wondering, it's not rated G. There are parts of the Bible that are very difficult for us. And a lot of what we read this week are very difficult sections for us to grapple with. And I had actually planned to grapple a little bit this morning. I had a kind of an outline going forward, and this is where I'm going. And as I kept working and trying to pull things together, I just felt like God was saying, you're not going where I want you to. It's like, well, this is where I want to go. And he kept saying, but you're not going where I want you to. So eventually I listened. Yeah, you're probably glad. But I want us to look this morning at a section that I've read numerous times, a section that as I began studying it, I realized that this is kind of the heart of the book of Joshua, or at least scholars view it this way. But it's a section that I'd never given much attention to. This section falls after the battle with Ai, or I, or A. I've heard it pronounced a lot of different ways this week. And it's right before the deception of Gibeon. And there's a little section, we're just about 6 verses, where Joshua renews the covenant with God, between God and the Israelite people. And some scholars call this really the heart of Joshua. It's really where everything comes together. It's really where the heart of what God is asking his people to do is on full display in this short little passage. And there are a lot of details that historians argue about and that scholars argue about. A lot of people say that this should be placed in a different spot. So some people say it was the first thing that they did before they defeated Jericho. Some people say it was as they were distributing the land. Some people say that it was after all the conquest was done. Or there's a lot of argument about where this story actually goes, and different manuscripts actually have it in different spots. So I don't know which one is right, but the heart of it is what I want us to focus on this morning. And so I want us to look this morning at Joshua chapter 8, starting with verse 30. At that time, Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal to the Lord, the God of Israel, just as Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded the Israelites. He built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool has been used. Then they offered burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed fellowship offerings on it. There on the stones, Joshua copied the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the Israelites, all Israel, resident, alien, and citizen alike, with their elders, officers, and judges, stood on either side of the ark of the Lord's covenant, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. Half of them were in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them were in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded earlier concerning blessing the people of Israel. And afterward, Joshua read aloud all the words of the law, the blessings as well as the curses, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read before the entire assembly of Israel, including the women, the dependents, and the resident aliens who lived among them. So this is a big deal for Israel, a great big deal. Although it only took a few verses, it's a huge deal for the nation of Israel. They are called to remember in this place their covenant with the God who had brought them here. Now, a part of what I did not know prior to studying this is kind of what emerged. I've never studied this passage before. Moses had commanded this in Deuteronomy. He actually gave quite a bit of time to this in Deuteronomy. It shows up in chapter 11. He kind of tells them this is what they're going to do. And then in chapters 27 and 28, Moses basically gives a script for everything that they're to say in this ceremony, everything that is to be said as they do this. And it's really set up as a powerful ceremony that the people of Israel are to follow. And Joshua appears to have followed all of the instructions that Moses set, with one exception. Actually, in Deuteronomy, the Levites were supposed to read the law, and in Joshua, he actually reads it. So that's the only exception, but the law was read. So half of the Israelites were to stand on one mountain, Mount Gerizim, and the other half were to stand on the next mountain over, Mount Ebal. And they were to shout back and forth the blessings and cursings of God. Now, the picture that you see in the background this morning is actually a picture from a trail up Spring Creek Road. A couple of months ago, John had mentioned to me, you need to take a drive out Dry Creek, and I had never had done that. I've always gone the other way, and so I took a drive out Dry Creek, and I turned on Reese Creek and then Spring Creek, and ended up where the sign said pavement ends. There's a little trailhead, and I pulled over there, and this picture kind of looks out over the valley. And let me see if I can get the words off of there for this morning. Come on. It could be towards Flathead Pass. I'm just not, there it is. Okay. I'm not super familiar with all of the comings and goings. I know I hit the sign on Spring Creek, or is it Spring Hill? Spring Hill. So I went through the little settlement of Spring Hill and then went to the sign where it said pavement ends. And you're kind of looking from that point, a very good vantage point to see the Gallatin Valley spread out below you. Absolutely beautiful. There was a lot of traffic, a lot of people walking their dogs up there, so I didn't hang out too long. But just a beautiful view looking out over the Gallatin Valley. And that's kind of the view that Israel had as they were setting on the two mountains. From these two mountains, Mount Ebal is the highest point in that area, and you can see the promised land kind of spread out beneath you. And here, with this view in mind, with the land that they have been promised, Israel is called to not only witness, but to participate in a ceremony where they are shouting to one another. So Moses even said, these tribes are on this mountain speaking the blessings, and these tribes are on this mountain speaking the cursings. And they're back and forth. This is what happens when you follow God, and this is what happens when you don't follow God. This is what happens when you follow God, and this is what happens when you don't follow God. Can you imagine how overwhelmingly powerful this experience would have been? The Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God, the thing that when the priest carrying it stepped their foot in the water's parted. This is out in full view. Normally it's in the tent, in the tabernacle. It's out in full view. And all of Israel is spread out so that they can see this and they can see the ark, they can see the land, and many scholars would argue that this is when Israel became a nation. They're in the land, they're reciting the Torah, the law, and they're participating together in this ceremony with the Ark of God, Ark of the Covenant, in full view. This is a big deal. Now let's see if I can get the text back on here. Maybe not. I love technology when it works. There we go. So in between these mountains was a valley. And it wasn't as wide as the Gallatin Valley. It was pretty small valley. But there's a town in this valley called Shechem. And I know that's pronounced a lot of different ways. That's how I'm going to pronounce it because I don't have enough phlegm this morning. But Shechem is a very important place in Jewish history. It's important because it was here in Shechem that Abraham first came when he went to the land that God had called him to. So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem at the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram here in this valley, in between the two mountains where the Israelites are now assembled, shouting across to one another. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So Abram built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. There's an importance of place here. This is an important place for the Israelites. When their ancestor Abraham, who had started all this journeying and back and forth, when their ancestor Abraham came to this place, this is where God spoke to Abraham and said, "I'm giving all of this land to your people." This is where God had first spoken this covenant with Abraham. And now, several hundred years later, the people of Israel are assembled on either mountain, and they're shouting across to one another as God's promise is being fulfilled. God had completed his promise to Abraham to bring his descendants back from Egypt to this very valley and to the mountains that overlook it. And so Joshua builds an altar. Now the altar is made up of uncut stones. It's stones that no iron tool has touched. And some of the stones are to be covered with plaster, and the covenant is to be written in the plaster. That's a little bit different than what I said on Wednesday night. I hadn't studied as in-depth in Deuteronomy by Wednesday night. But the covenant was to be written in plaster so that the people could look at this altar and they could see the words of the covenant. They could see what they were promising to do. They understood the blessings and they understood the cursings. They understood the covenant that they were making with God. It wasn't their covenant first, it was Abraham's covenant first. It was reaffirmed to Jacob and to Isaac and to Joseph. This covenant, and a lot of that took place in this valley. Something interesting that I found this week as I was studying, and my commentaries range in age. I've got some from the 1800s all the way up through some that were most recently written. And some of my commentaries for the 80s and 90s started talking about an archaeologist finding an altar on the side of Mount Ebal, but didn't believe that it was Joshua's altar. But they'd found an altar. They talked about that. And then as the commentaries got newer and newer, they started talking about Joshua's altar on the side of Mount Ebal. And it's a fascinating process of an altar that was found on the side of Mount Ebal. And the original dating to this was a couple of hundred years after Joshua. So the area of the Judges that we're going to read next, that's when they aged this altar to. And it's an altar that mirrors the altar in the temple. And it was clearly a Jewish altar. So when the archaeologist that found this altar came upon the site, he wasn't a believer. He wasn't looking to find Joshua's altar. In fact, a lot of biblical archaeologists had been on Mount Ebal looking for this altar, and they were all looking at the crest, or they were looking at the west side, which overlooks Mount Gerizim and overlooks the Valley of Shechem. They didn't look on the east side, even though Moses had commanded in Deuteronomy that all the altars should face east. And so biblical archaeologists had come and gone, said there's no remnants of this altar. And this archaeologist in the late 70s, early 80s came across this site, and it was just a stone mound. And there were stones intentionally placed on top. And as he started lifting these stones up, he realized they were intentionally placed to protect the site that was there. Whether that was a religious ceremony to keep it sacred, there's history in later in the Kings where one of the kings said, we've got to tear down all of the altars. And there were altars to God spread out. It wasn't just the altars to pagan gods. But somebody had clearly put stones in to protect this space so that it would not be disturbed. And they kept pulling the stones away, and this altar emerged. Now, again, as I said, that the archaeologist wasn't a believer. He apparently wasn't even fully aware of what he'd found, and he kind of sketched it out. He was sitting in a restaurant, a little cafe in town, and a religious person came up and said, is that what you found up there? He said, yeah, this is it. I'm trying to make sense of it. And the guy pointed, is like, that's an exact replica of the altar that's in the temple, in the second temple. It's the exact replica. And the archaeologist who believed that the Bible was full of myths just started arguing. He's like, no, because if this is really that, then that means that the Bible is real. It means that Joshua was a real person. It means that Moses was a real person. It means that the Bible's real. And I'm not ready to accept that. And yet, through this experience, that archaeologist did come to be a believer. He came to see that there is historical evidence for the story that he had read about and dismissed as myths. But this altar that he had found was clearly dated a couple hundred years after Joshua. So he kept digging, and he found a smaller altar, just a round ring inside of the altar that's more visible. And that one dated back about 200 years earlier to the time of Joshua. It's interesting, and I read a number of articles, and there's a lot of people who take this too far, and there's actually a discovery there in the last couple of years that some claim is the oldest Hebrew writing ever discovered, and that one is still being hotly contested, and I'm not about to wade into that argument. But the archaeologists that found this in the 70s and 80s and spent time researching it came to know that the Bible is true, that God is real because of what he found at this altar site. And here's a picture of this today. It's kind of hard to point out. I can do it this way. So right here is a ramp. And that ramp goes up. You've got two little courtyard areas, and then you've got an area back here. This is where the round altar that they found is at. But it's a powerful archaeological find. Here's an artist rendering of it, and that gives you a little bit better understanding of it. The Installation 94 is what they believe to actually be Joshua's altar. They did a lot of testing on what they were finding there. Of course, it's an altar. There's a lot of ashes. And a part of what they tested for was what kind of bones fragments are in the ashes. Well, in a Jewish world, you wouldn't sacrifice a pig. They found no unclean animals in this altar. And all the other altars that they found from this era, they didn't believe to be Jewish because they found those unclean animals. This one had no unclean animals. The law is also very particular about the age of the animals that are offered. And the bone fragments that they found were all from very young animals. And so it took about 30, 40 years, but now there's pretty widespread acceptance of this actually being Joshua's altar. That this is a place where Joshua offered the sacrifices, where Joshua brought, he didn't offer them, the Levites offered them, but he brought the people of Israel to this place and renewed the covenant. This is sacred space. This is a place for the Israelites as they're there in the footsteps of Abraham. This Shechem also shows up in the story of Jacob, and it also shows up in the story of Joseph. This is actually where Jacob sent Joseph to find his brothers. They were supposed to be around Shechem. They weren't. They'd moved on to Dothan, but this is where Joseph came looking for his brothers. But here in this special place, walking in the footsteps of their ancestors, Joshua renews the covenant between God and this people. They're gathered on opposite sides of the mountains. And, you know, it kind of made me think it'd be fun to go do a camp out sometime and have half of us on one peak and half of us on the other and just shouting praises back and forth. They worshiped. They worshiped as they gathered on top of this mountain. They worshiped through their sacrifices. They worshiped through their words. I'm guessing that they sang some songs. They probably sang the song of deliverance that Miriam had written as they came out of the Red Sea. I'm guessing they sang a couple of other songs. It was just a very sacred, special time as they gathered here, overlooking Shechem, but in the land that God had promised. The land that for hundreds of years these people had waited to inhabit. This generation that has come into the promised land has spent their entire life on the journey from Egypt to here. They would have been very young children when Moses came and started talking in Egypt about freeing them. They would have been very young children as they walked through the Red Sea as it split. And they would have grown up in the desert, waiting to enter this land that they now find themselves in. They're in the middle of a war, a conquest, and they worship. And I know scholars argue about when this takes place. I'm going to leave it where it's at right now and say after a humiliating defeat, Ai was a very humiliating defeat. They worship. After several humbling victories, you know, Jericho wasn't a victory that they could kind of pat themselves on the back for. It's you just look up at God and say, He's the one that brought these walls down. We didn't do anything. It's all God. They worship. And after they eventually defeated Ai, again, it wasn't, this is us being all powerful. We got our tails whipped when we tried to do it on our own strength. After several humbling victories, they worship. Here in the footsteps of their ancestors, they worship. And I think that this is a powerful reminder for us as well. A reminder for us to worship even when everything's chaotic around us. One of the things that I'm doing as I start this new year is I'm taking time each of my Sabbaths and just kind of reading back through some of my old journals. And I've got journals dating back to 2002, I think, is when I started journaling, 2002, 2003. And there's a lot of garbage in there, and there's a lot of stupid decisions and a lot of stupid stuff, and I can't believe I was even worried about that or even thinking this. But there's also a lot of things in this that says, wow, God came through. And as I read through my journals again yesterday, and as we talked as a family last night in our family devotions, it just felt like I was picking up stones as I read through those journals and building an altar and remembering God was faithful in this. 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 And I'm building an altar of God's faithfulness. All of the things that he's done. There are a lot of things that I've been praying for years that haven't come true. But I trust that God will, because I know that God has. And this ceremony, as the Israelites gather, and I'm guessing that they had representatives from every tribe come and bring a stone because that's how they typically did things. They built this altar and they said, look at God's faithfulness to us. Somewhere down there are stones that were used for Abraham's altar. Somewhere down there are stones that Jacob probably worshiped at. Somewhere down there are stones that our ancestors have walked upon. And they're the ones who said, who God made the covenant with, that we would come to this land, and here we are. I think for us today, it's probably appropriate for us to take some time to think about the battles that we've faced that God has been faithful in. Every one of us in this room have areas or times when God has come through in powerful ways. Stones in the altar. As we live in the midst of chaos, and as I look across this room, I don't know any of us whose lives aren't just a little bit chaotic in some ways, because we're living in unprecedented times. In the middle of the chaos, in the middle of the unprecedented times, we need to worship. So I shifted the service around a little bit so that we could worship a little bit more after the sermon. But I want to remind us that worship is a response to what God has done. It's the gathering of these stones. It's remembering how God has worked in our lives. What he has done historically, it's remembering that the God that we worship existed long before we did. The God that we worship existed thousands of years ago. He is without beginning. He has existed and has helped humanity throughout history. And the stories that we're reading, whilst parts of them are difficult, parts of them are also powerful reminders that this God keeps his promises. And we worship him because of what he's done historically, but we worship him because what he has done in our lives. There's stuff as I look back through journals yesterday, I can't believe God got us through that. There's situations where I was so overwhelmed. There's pages in my journals that are stained where the tears fell and the water washed the ink, and I remember the emotion of those moments, and yet God got us through that. And then there's the reality that God is still working in our lives today. God is still doing things in our lives today. So I want us to follow this example. I want us to renew our covenant with God, and we're going to do that this morning through communion. I want us to renew the covenant with God, not with tablets of stone and plaster, but with the cup and the bread. And then I want us this morning to worship. Lonnie and Fred, would you guys help me with the communion elements this morning? Heavenly Father, I thank you for the privilege that we have of renewing the covenant with you. The covenant that was established back on the mountain or in the valley of Shechem. But the covenant that was reconfirmed over and over again throughout Israel's history. and the covenant that changed, that shifted on the night that Jesus was betrayed. When he gathered his disciples in the upper room and he said, "This is the cup of a new covenant." This is something new. It's attached to, it's a part of the old, but it's something new. It's the fulfillment of the covenant. And as we partake of the elements together today, remind us that we are renewing our covenant with you. Now, God, there may be some in this room this morning that have never made that profession of faith. They've never made that decision to follow you. And if that be the case, then there's no better time than right now to say, I'm entering into this covenant with you. By partaking of this bread, of this cup, I enter into the covenant. I enter into a relationship with you. The God who has been building the stones, the altar in my life, long before I even knew it was an altar. The ways that you have come through in our lives over and over and over again. God, may we rejoice in this covenant today. May we find the joy that the Israelites felt as they were standing on the mountaintops, shouting across the valley to one another. This is what it means to follow God. This is what it means if we don't follow God. This is what it means to follow God. God, would you use these elements today to remind us of your covenant, to remind us of our relationship with you that passes beyond all time, that stretches long into eternity, and that existed long before we even existed. Thank you for this covenant. Thank you for the chance to participate in this covenant renewal. In Jesus' name, amen.